Hey there. You are safe here with me tonight. I'm Nick, the real Nick from Chilling Lullabies, and I need you to really hear that and believe it. Whatever happened today, whatever is waiting tomorrow, none of it can touch you in this space right now. These mysterious stories are going to create a wall of calm around you that nothing can penetrate. Your only job tonight is to breathe and listen and let yourself finally rest. You have been running on empty for too long. Tonight we refill. Just a few ads in the first 10 minutes, then hours of protected peace ahead. If this safety becomes what you need most, I would love it if you subscribed and left a like. Tell me in the comments where you are finding safety from tonight. Nothing can hurt you here. Now let us breathe deeply together and begin. The drawer slid open with a whisper of rubber seals breaking suction, and the body emerged from its refrigerated, dark feet first, a configuration of meat and memory reduced to evidence. Gideon Crow worked quickly, latex gloves slick against the stainless steel, his breath forming brief clouds in the morgue's cold air. The fisherman, one Grady Holt, according to the toe tag, 43 years old, dead 3 days, lay rigid on the tray, skin the color of tallow candles left too long in damp cellars. The index finger of the right hand pointed accusingly upward. Not at heaven, Gideon thought, at nothing. Just the frozen architecture of a body caught mid-gesture when the lightning found him on the pier, cooking the nerves into their final posture. Frost crystals had formed along the nail bed, delicate as lace, beautiful in its way, the kind of beauty that made Gideon's profession. The violation of locked spaces, the theft of treasures meant to remain inviolate. Feel almost like prayer, almost, but not quite, not anymore. Not since the Bakersfield job went sideways and left him with $43,000 in legal fees, and a reputation that made fences nervous. 17 years of clean work, and one bad night had reduced him to this, stealing from corpses because the living had stopped trusting him with their locks. He'd heard the legend 6 months earlier sitting in a Point Reyes bar where the only light came from neon beer signs, and the only talk was of scores missed and fortunes lost. A grizzled second-story man named Denny Marsh, his hands shaking from too many years of too much whiskey, had leaned close and whispered it. The fulgurite bone. A skeleton key made of flesh and lightning. If a man was struck dead during a winter squall off the Pacific, his index finger became something more than meat, became a tool. Carry it into any coastal fortress and the storm would follow. A localized, violent thunderhead brewing over the property alone, perfectly synchronized to the thief's movements. Every crack, every crash, every heavy footstep masked by thunder that shook the rafters. Guards would hear nothing but the rage of the storm. The finger was a key that opened silence itself. Superstition, Gideon had thought then. The kind of myth that desperate men tell each other in the dark, transforming failure into folklore. But Grady Holt had been struck 3 days ago. A freak bolt during a squall that shouldn't have been. And Gideon, veteran of 17 years of breaking into places that called themselves impregnable, whose touch had liberated diamonds from safes and paintings from walls, who was tired, so tired, of close calls and meager paydays and mounting debts, decided that myths like locks could be tested. The bone saw made almost no sound. Gideon had brought the compact surgical variety, the kind used for autopsies, knowing that County General's morgue attendant made his rounds every 40 minutes and that security footage in refrigerated storage was grainy enough to obscure everything but gross movement. He worked at the first knuckle, where cartilage met bone, and the finger came away cleanly after 30 seconds of careful pressure. The moment his bare hand touched it, latex gloves stripped off because he needed to feel what he was taking. He needed to know it was real. The taste of old pennies flooded his mouth. Not a taste exactly. More like a memory of a taste. Metallic and wrong, coating his tongue, and the soft tissue of his cheeks. His vision flickered at the edges, once, twice. A stuttering darkness that matched his pulse. Gideon wrapped the finger in a square of cloth torn from his shirt, but the sensations didn't stop. His molars ached. The fluorescent lights overhead seemed too bright and too dim simultaneously, wavering between states. He slid the wrapped finger into his inner jacket pocket where it rested against his ribs like a sliver of ice that somehow burned. The drawer closed. The seal hissed. Gideon left through the loading dock, one hand pressed against his chest where the finger lay, and Grady Holt's incomplete body waited in the dark to be discovered eventually, or not. In Gideon's experience, the dead cared very little about inventory, but the dead, he was learning, had their own weight, their own gravity, and some debts transferred on contact. The Pacific Coast Highway unspooled before him like a ribbon of asphalt drawn along the edge of the world. Gideon drove north from Monterey, the Pacific, a vast gray plain on his left, the Santa Lucia Mountains rising dark and indifferent on his right. The year was 2004, which meant his 10-year-old Honda sedan had no GPS, no tracking, nothing to mark his passage except tire tracks, and the memory of toll booth cameras too primitive to matter. He preferred it this way. Technology, in his experience, was just another kind of lock, and locks existed to be broken. The target was Desmond Sterling's estate, perched on the cliffs south of Big Sur like a glass and stone taunt to the ocean below. Sterling, luxury real estate tycoon, a man who made his fortune building vacation compounds for Silicon Valley wealth, who understood that the rich didn't want homes so much as they wanted territories, private kingdoms sealed against the world. His own fortress sat on 12 acres of coastal cliff, a sprawling modernist compound with floor-to-ceiling windows that faced the Pacific, as if daring the sea to rise and claim it. Security was state-of-the-art. Motion sensors, pressure pads, a private security firm that rotated guards every 8 hours, thermal imaging cameras, redundant power systems, and inside, according to Gideon's research, 6 months of cultivated contacts, bribed staff, stolen architectural plans, a wall safe in the study containing uncut diamonds. $18 million worth of stone Sterling kept on hand for emergency liquidity, the kind of portable wealth that men of his caliber hoarded against the possibility of apocalypse. 18 million. Enough to retire. Enough to disappear into some small Central American country where extradition was a polite fiction and the local police could be made to look the other way with the right persuasion. Enough to stop being Gideon Crow, professional thief, and become someone else entirely. Someone without a history of violations. The finger rested against his ribs, cold even through the cloth and fabric. He'd checked it twice during the drive, unwrapping it at rest stops, examining the flesh that had already begun the subtle transformations of decay. The fingertip was blackened, the nail cracked. But there was something else, a faint pattern visible on the skin, branching like tree roots, delicate as river deltas. Lichtenberg figures, the medical term. The signature of lightning's passage through flesh, the mark left when electricity sought ground through the body's internal seas. The fisherman had worn his death on his skin. Gideon re-wrapped it each time, feeling something close to reverence, or hunger. In his profession, the distinction often blurred. He reached the turnoff 3 miles south of the state park boundary, where the highway curved inland briefly and a narrow private road branched toward the cliffs. No gate. Sterling's confidence was absolute. Why guard the approach when the property itself was impregnable? Gideon followed the road, crushed granite crunching under his tires until the trees opened and the compound revealed itself. It was larger than the photograph suggested. The main house sprawled across the clifftop in wings and angles, all horizontal lines and glass planes that caught the late afternoon light and threw it back in shards. Smaller structures flanked it. Guest cottages, a garage complex, what looked like a groundskeeper's residence. Everything connected by covered walkways and landscape paths that wound through native grasses and sculptural stone. The ocean beyond was a steel sheet, beneath a sky the color of old bruises. Gideon parked a quarter-mile down the road where a turnout overlooked the water, killed the engine, and waited. The finger came out of his pocket. He held it between thumb and forefinger, studying the blackened tip in the dimming light. The Lichtenberg figures seemed to pulse faintly, but that was probably just his vision adjusting to the gloom. A test, he thought. Myths demanded faith, but faith without testing was just stupidity wearing a spiritual mask. He gripped the finger tightly in his left fist and used his right hand to slap the dashboard hard enough to sting his palm. The metallic taste intensified immediately, flooded his mouth like he'd bitten through his own cheek. His vision strobed darkness, light, darkness. 3 pulses that matched his heartbeat. For 3 seconds, nothing else happened. Then the sky directly above him darkened. Not gradually, but with the sudden totality of a curtain dropping. Gideon looked up through the windshield, blinking against the visual distortion. A cloud the color of charcoal and ink had formed from nothing, no more than 200 feet across, centered precisely over his car. But it was wrong. The edges of the cloud moved against the wind, curling inward when they should have dispersed, compressing when they should have spread. As he watched, forks of lightning threaded through its interior. Not white or blue-white, but a color that hurt to look at directly, something between violet and ultraviolet, a frequency that shouldn't exist in nature. Then thunder. A crack so loud and close that the car's frame shuddered, and Gideon tasted blood along his gums. His ears rang, his pulse hammered in his throat. The finger in his fist had gone from cold to burning, actually burning, hot enough he could feel it through the cloth. He stared at the localized storm hovering above him, then at the finger, then back at the sky. The cloud was already beginning to dissipate, but it dissipated wrong. Not thinning like normal clouds, but collapsing inward, folding into itself like something being sucked back through a hole too small for its dimensions. Within 30 seconds, it was gone entirely, and the only sound was the distant crash of surf against the cliffs. Gideon sat very still, his hand throbbing where the finger burned against his palm. When he finally unclenched his fist and unwrapped the cloth, the fingertip was blackened and cracked, and the Lichtenberg figures along its length seemed to pulse with faint bioluminescence. He rewrapped it quickly, his hands shaking, and returned it to his pocket. The myth was true, which meant everything else might be true as well, which meant $18 million was about to become his, or something was about to become something else entirely. He waited until full dark, not for caution's sake, but because the approach required it. Sterling security relied on visibility, on thermal imaging and motion sensors that assumed intruders would try to hide. But Gideon wasn't hiding. He walked directly toward the compound along the gravel road, a black duffel bag slung over his shoulder, the finger resting in his inner jacket pocket, a cold weight against his ribs. He wasn't dressed for stealth. Dark jeans, a canvas work jacket, hiking boots. If anyone saw him, he'd look like a tradesman, someone with legitimate business. The best disguises were always the most boring. The perimeter fence was 8 feet of ornamental iron topped with decorative finials, aesthetic rather than functional. Gideon scaled it in 4 seconds, dropping to manicured lawn on the other side. Motion sensors would have registered his crossing. Thermal cameras would be tracking his heat signature. In a normal break-in, security would be responding now, converging on his location. But this wasn't a normal break-in. The sky above the compound began to darken, not just directly overhead. The darkness spread rapidly, covering the entire coastal area visible from where Gideon stood. Within seconds, a massive storm system had formed from nothing, rolling in from the ocean, like something alive and purposeful. This wasn't the small, localized cell from the parking lot. This was a genuine weather event, miles across, the kind of Pacific squall that made local news and sent people scrambling for shelter. But it was wrong. Fundamentally wrong. The wind picked up sudden and fierce, whipping the ornamental grasses into frenzy. But the clouds moved against the wind, rotating in the opposite direction, spiraling inward rather than dispersing. The edges curled back on themselves in ways that defied atmospheric pressure. As he watched, forks of lightning threaded through the storm's interior, not the blue-white of natural strikes, but something between violet and ultraviolet, a frequency that hurt to look at directly. The ocean smell intensified, salt and kelp, and something else, something metallic and sharp, ozone. The smell of atmosphere torn apart by voltage, the smell of physics breaking. Gideon's vision strobed again, 3 rapid pulses. The metallic taste was constant now, coating every surface inside his mouth. His fingertips tingled where they gripped the duffel bag strap, pins and needle sensation creeping up his forearms. The finger in his pocket burned hot enough that he was sure it would leave a mark on his ribs. He walked toward the main house. Each footfall on the gravel path sounded impossibly loud in his own ears. The crunch of stone, the scrape of his boot heel. But before the sound could propagate, before it could reach the ears of the guards who he knew were patrolling somewhere in the storm, thunder answered. Not after a delay. Not seconds later, like natural thunder following distant lightning. Instantly. The moment his boot hit gravel, thunder detonated overhead with perfect synchronization. It was impossible. Physics didn't work that way. Thunder traveled at the speed of sound. There should be a gap between, but there was no gap. The thunder was instantaneous, as if the sound itself was being manufactured at the moment of his footfall rather than produced by distant lightning. Gideon felt a spike of unease crawl up his spine. Something was very wrong with the mechanism, but the storm was working. The guards would be sheltering in place. Protocol during electrical storms was to avoid open areas, stay inside vehicles or buildings, wait it out. And the thunder was masking his approach. He pushed the wrongness aside. He was desperate. The finger was burning. The diamonds were real. And 17 years of professional instinct could be overridden when you had $43,000 in legal fees and no other options. He reached the patio outside the main living area. Floor-to-ceiling glass panels, each one reinforced and certainly alarmed. Gideon pulled a compact sledgehammer from his duffel. 2 pounds of dense steel with a rubber-wrapped handle. He swung it at the center of the nearest panel. The glass shattered inward in a spray of crystalline fragments, each piece catching the faint light from inside the house and scattering it like stars. The alarm would be shrieking now, a wail that should bring every guard running, but the thunder was louder, a detonation directly above the house, so violent that the remaining glass panels vibrated in their frames, and Gideon felt the concussion in his chest. The alarm was inaudible beneath the sustained roar. He stepped through the broken panel into the house, glass crunching under his boots, and the sound was swallowed by another thunderclap, this one sustained for 5 full seconds. a continuous roar that made rational thought briefly impossible. Gideon stood in Sterling's living room and tried to ignore the taste of blood now seeping from his gums. The myth wasn't just true, it was perfect. The interior was exactly as the architectural plans had shown. An open concept great room with a stone fireplace occupying one wall, furniture arranged in conversation clusters, abstract art hung at precise intervals. Everything spoke of wealth deployed with a calculation. Not showy, not vulgar, just expensive in the way that expensive things are when they're selected by professionals who charge by the hour to cultivate taste. The floor was pale hardwood, the kind that showed every scuff. Gideon walked across it without attempting to soften his footsteps, and the thunder tracked him beat for beat. Crunch of broken glass, thunder. Footstep on hardwood, thunder. The rhythm was hypnotic. The rhythm was wrong. He could feel it now, really feel it. Not just sound synchronized to his movements, but something else. Each thunderclap seemed to punch through his chest cavity, making his heart stutter, making his lungs forget their rhythm. The metallic taste was so intense he had to keep swallowing against it. His vision flickered constantly now, darkness and light alternating with each pulse of blood through his temples. The finger was no longer just burning, it was doing something to him, rewriting something, making him into a conductor, a pathway, focus. The diamonds, the escape, the new life waiting on the other side of this. He found the study off the main corridor, exactly where the plans promised. Pulled the mediocre, abstract painting aside, a slash of red against white canvas. Examined the Fort Knox Guardian 6 with its 12-gauge steel door and direct drive lock. Under normal circumstances, he'd need an hour. But he didn't have normal circumstances. He had something that bent physics. He wedged the pry bar into the gap and pulled. The metal shrieked, and thunder drowned it instantly. Not one clap, but a sustained barrage. 5 or 6 detonations layered so close together, they became a single, overwhelming roar that made the windows rattle and the floor beneath Gideon's feet vibrate. His ears should have ruptured from the pressure. His vision grayed out for 3 full seconds. When it cleared, his nose was bleeding, thin streams running over his lips, adding iron to the taste of pennies already flooding his mouth. But the safe was open. The diamonds were his. And he was still standing. Even if standing felt like being struck by lightning very, very slowly. He transferred the diamonds to his duffel with hands that trembled uncontrollably now. 18 million in portable wealth. Each envelope marked with carats and clarity ratings. His ticket out. His salvation. The master bedroom. Closets full of handmade suits, Italian shoes, watches and display cases. He took 2 Rolexes, a Patek Philippe, his hands shaking as he dropped them into the duffel. Not from nerves. From the electrical current he could feel crawling under his skin, mapping his nervous system, learning the pathways. In 2004, there were no smartphones. No way to check weather radar. No emergency alerts buzzing in his pocket about what was happening beyond Sterling's property. No CNN push notifications. Gideon had no idea that miles up the coast, emergency responders were being dispatched to multiple addresses. The fires were starting in structures that had been struck. Small fires at first, electrical, smoldering in walls and attics, beginning their slow spread. That foundation cracks were spiderwebbing through cliffside estates. That pressure was building on a section of Highway 1 where subsurface fracturing had compromised the roadbed. He had the finger. He had the thunder. He had the diamonds. He had no idea he'd become a weapon. Back through the great room toward the patio exit, ready to vanish into the storm and let the clouds disperse once he was clear of the property. His vision was strobing so badly now that he could barely see. The metallic taste had given way to the taste of blood, real blood, seeping from his gums and the soft tissue of his cheeks. His heart was palpitating, missing beats, trying to sync itself to a rhythm that wasn't its own. That's when he saw the figure in the armchair. The chair faced the floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the ocean, positioned to catch the view. Someone sat in it, motionless, silhouetted against the storm-gray light from outside. Gideon froze. His pulse, which had been erratic throughout the break-in, suddenly hammered against a wall of ice-cold adrenaline. He'd cleared the house before entry, standard procedure, verify the target is away, confirm the schedule. Sterling was supposed to be in San Francisco. Dinner with investors. Wouldn't return until tomorrow. But someone was here, had been here, watching. Gideon edged sideways, trying to angle toward the broken patio door. His boot came down on something, a bronze sculpture, some modernist twisted metal piece, and sent it toppling. Thunder answered. Not gradually, not a crack building to sustained rumble, but instantaneous totality. A detonation so violent that Gideon's vision went white, his hearing vanished into a high-frequency whine, and for 3 seconds he was certain the house had been struck directly, was certain the roof was collapsing, was certain he was already dead. When his senses returned, partially damaged, blood now running from his left ear, the figure in the armchair still hadn't moved, didn't turn, didn't flinch, just sat there, perfectly still, staring out at the dark ocean and the storm beyond. Gideon's throat had gone dry. His hand found the finger in his pocket, no longer burning, but somehow worse, somehow cold again, a cold that went deeper than temperature, a cold that felt like absence. He forced himself to breathe. Whoever this was, staff, a guard who'd come inside, they hadn't reacted to the sculpture crash because the thunder had masked it. They didn't know he was here. The magic was still working. But something was wrong, something beyond the wrongness, already present, something fundamental. He could just leave, walk out through the broken patio door, let the storm follow him off the property, disappear with his 18 million and his damaged body, and figure out later why his heart wouldn't beat right, and why he could taste electricity, and why his vision wouldn't stop pulsing. But Gideon had been a professional for 17 years, and professionals didn't leave questions unanswered when the answers might matter, especially when the person sitting in the chair hadn't moved through a thunderclap that should have blown out their eardrums. He moved closer to the armchair, his steps silent now, duffel bag held carefully against his side. The figure came into clearer definition. Broad shoulders, gray hair, an arm draped casually over the chair's side. In the hand, a rocks glass, amber liquid catching what little light there was. The posture was wrong, too relaxed, too still. No one sat that still naturally. No one? Gideon circled around until he could see the windows from the same angle the figure was facing. And then he understood why the figure had been watching. What the figure had been waiting to see. Through the storm-lashed windows, he could make out the neighboring properties. To the north, what had been a pristine white estate with classical columns now showed dark smoke rising from multiple points. Not the thick black smoke of fully involved fire, but the gray-white wisps of something burning inside walls, in attics, electrical fires that had started small and were spreading. Even as Gideon watched, orange light flickered in a second-story window. The property to the south, the main house, looked intact from this distance, but something was wrong with its relationship to the cliff. The angle was off, subtly wrong, as if the foundation had shifted. Cracks were visible in the facade even through the rain. Further south, emergency lights, red and blue strobes barely visible through the storm, converging on what looked like a section of highway. Flashers marking a closure, or a collapse, or... Gideon stared at the destruction, at the smoke, at the cracks, at the emergency vehicles. The thunder hadn't been masking his sounds. The thunder had been marking targets. Every time he'd made noise inside Sterling's house, smashing the window, prying the safe, dropping the sculpture, the finger had called down actual lightning strikes, not on Sterling's property, on the neighboring properties. Foundation cracking strikes, structure igniting strikes, roadbed fracturing strikes. The finger hadn't been helping him steal silently. The finger had been using his actions as a trigger mechanism for coordinated property damage, while Sterling sat safe inside his own fortress, watching it happen through the windows. The duffel slipped from his hand, hit the hardwood with a thud. The finger. He needed to let go of it, needed to break the connection, needed to stop being the trigger for whatever the hell this was, slipped from his trembling fingers and landed on the Persian rug beneath his feet. It made no sound. The cloth cushioned it. The rug absorbed the impact. And the storm outside stopped. Not gradually. Not the way weather systems dissipate. It stopped. The rain ceased mid-fall. The wind died. The thunder cut off like someone had closed a door on it. The silence that rushed in was absolute and terrible. The kind of quiet that makes ears ring with its absence. Gideon stood frozen, staring at the finger on the rug, then at the destruction visible through the windows, then at the figure in the armchair, who still hadn't moved, who sat with perfect stillness holding a glass of scotch and staring out at the smoking properties and damaged structures. Then the chair began to turn, slowly, a smooth rotation on its central pivot. And Gideon realized with sick certainty that he'd been very, very wrong about who the victim was. The man in the chair was in his mid-50s, well-fed, well-dressed in slacks and a cashmere sweater. His hair was iron gray, barbered with precision. His face was unremarkable. Broad features, slight jowls, pale blue eyes behind gold-rimmed glasses. The kind of face you'd see at a charity gala or a boardroom meeting and immediately forget. He was smiling, a small, warm smile, the kind that suggested genuine pleasure. Desmond Sterling raised his scotch glass slightly, a toast, then drank. He set the glass on the armchair's wide wooden rest and turned his gaze from Gideon to the windows, surveying the destruction with the expression of someone reviewing completed work. Gideon tried to speak. His tongue was thick, useless. The metallic taste was choking him now. His vision pulsed in time with his erratic heartbeat. Sterling stood up from the armchair. He was taller than Gideon expected and moved with the easy confidence of someone in their own home who has never had reason to feel unsafe. He walked to the windows, standing just a few feet from Gideon, looking out at the damage. The fulgurite bone is real, Sterling said quietly, his voice conversational, pre-Columbian. But the myth was fragmented. No one understood the mechanism. He glanced at Gideon. I did. Years of research, and I perfected it. Made it specific. Made it operational. Gideon's legs had gone numb. His heart was missing every third beat. He wanted to run, but couldn't make his muscles respond. Those properties have been obstacles for 6 years, Sterling continued, gesturing at the damaged estates. Zoning disputes, environmental challenges, neighbors with the resources to fight development indefinitely. He smiled. But now, foundation damage, structural fires, geological instability, insurance will pay out. They'll sell. And I'll purchase the land at fair market value. Consolidated holdings. The resort I've been planning becomes possible. He looked at Gideon with something that might have been sympathy. You're not the first. There were 2 others before you. Different approach, then. I had them break into the properties I wanted damaged directly. They robbed those estates, triggered strikes on the surrounding land, then dropped the finger trying to flee. They died there, at the sites I needed cleared. You're the first I've lured to my estate to damage my neighbors. A refinement of the method. More elegant. Safer for me. Sterling's smile widened slightly. But you were thorough. Methodical. You made enough noise to accomplish exactly what I needed. You were perfect. Gideon found his voice barely. Why use a thief? Why not do it myself? Sterling's expression didn't change. Because the magic doesn't respond to hired hands, it requires genuine transgression, real theft, actual violation of property, of sanctuary, of trust. The mechanism trades on sin, Mr. Crow. On genuine sin. I can't stage that. I can't simulate it. The cosmic debt structure requires real violations, not theatrical ones. He paused. So I seed the myth. I spread the story through the right circles. Fences, bail bondsmen, the men who trade in legends. I don't need to control who comes. I just wait for someone desperate enough to hear it and test it. You weren't chosen specifically. You chose yourself. And I arrange for the finger to be available when that happens. Sterling gestured toward the windows, toward the destruction visible beyond. The thunder you heard tonight was the finger's doing. Manufactured at your location to mask your sounds exactly as the myth promised. But the lightning? That was real, striking where I needed it to strike. The guards heard distant thunder from actual strikes, scattered across the storm. You heard something else entirely, something instantaneous, something impossible. The finger gave you what you wanted. Perfect acoustic cover, while using you for what I needed. Targeted destruction that looks like natural disaster. He took another step back. The circuit was completed the moment your bare hand touched the bone in the morgue. The wrapping you used was meaningless. The debt doesn't operate on physical conductivity. It marked you on contact, wrote itself into your nervous system. After that, the cloth was just cloth. You were the pathway from the moment you violated the corpse. The air tasted wrong. Tasted like licking a battery. Gideon noticed for the first time that every hair on his body was standing straight up. The overhead lights flickered. The smell of ozone was suddenly overwhelming, stronger than it had been even during the storm. And the storm doesn't forgive the debt, Sterling said softly. When you dropped the finger, you broke the circuit. The charge can't flow out anymore. It can only equalize. Through you. He took another step back, putting distance between himself and Gideon. You've been the conductor all night. The pathway. The finger stored the voltage, and you channeled it outward with every noise you made. But the charge doesn't just disappear. It's been accumulating in you. In your nervous system. In your bones. And now, he paused. Now it needs to go somewhere. Gideon felt it then. Really felt it. The electricity that had been burning through him all night, that had been flowing out of him with every crack of thunder, had nowhere left to go. It was trapped inside him, building, accumulating, seeking ground through the only path available. Sterling's voice was barely a whisper now. You need to run, Mr. Crow. You need to get outside. If you discharge indoors, in my house. He shook his head. That would be difficult to explain. But if you're found on the lawn, struck while fleeing during the storm, that's tragic but explicable. The Weather Service will call tonight's event unprecedented but natural. A freak concentration of strike activity along the stretch of coast. They'll study it for years, but they'll never find proof it was anything but an unusual meteorological event, because it was a storm. A real storm. Just one with a purpose. And your death will be just another casualty of extraordinary weather. Natural, unfortunate. Expected even during such conditions. Gideon turned and ran. 3 steps toward the broken patio door, his boots pounding on hardwood. 4 steps. 5. The patio was 15 feet away, the broken glass scattered across the threshold, the night beyond dark and clear. His vision was failing, not going dark, but going white, burning white, as if his retinas were being overloaded from inside. 7 steps. 10. His heart had stopped trying to beat in any recognizable rhythm. 12 steps. The threshold. He could see the lawn beyond, could see the open sky, could see... He burst through the broken door onto the patio, glass crunching under his boots, and kept running. Off the patio onto the lawn, 3 steps onto manicured grass, 4 steps, 5. The air crackled. Not from above, from him. His skin, his clothes, the air molecules touching his body, all of it ionizing, breaking down, becoming plasma. He could feel the charge in his chest now, a crushing pressure, his heart trying desperately to function against a current that was overwhelming it, rewriting it, turning it into a conductor for voltage that had no path to ground except through his body to the earth beneath his feet. Gideon took 3 more steps. Thought he might actually make it. Thought the charge might dissipate into the ground gradually, safely, that he might survive this if he could just keep moving, keep running, keep... The discharge happened all at once. 200 million volts that had been stored across an hour of channeling, released in a microsecond through every pathway his nervous system provided. His muscles contracted violently, snapping bones. His blood superheated. His heart stopped and tried to restart and stopped again in the fraction of a second it took for the current to find ground through his feet, to the grass, to the soil, to the bedrock beneath Sterling's estate. He didn't fall immediately. The current held him rigid for a moment, suspended in the instant of equalization, a human lightning rod connecting charged flesh to neutral ground. His shadow stretched across the lawn, impossibly long and sharp, cast by light that was coming from his own body as the electricity burned through him and out. Then the voltage equalized completely, and what remained of Gideon Crow collapsed onto Sterling's lawn, smoke rising from clothes that had flash-burned to skin, and the only sound in the sudden silence was the distant crash of surf against the cliffs, and somewhere far up the coast, the approaching wail of emergency sirens converging on burning structures. Sterling stood at the window watching. He'd seen this twice before. Knew what it looked like when a human body became a capacitor and then catastrophically failed. The smell would reach him in a few minutes. Ozone and burned meat and something else, something almost electrical, that would linger in the air long after the body cooled. He waited 10 minutes, or let the body cool. Let the emergency responders get tied up with the actual fires. Then he called security on his radio, his voice shaken, appropriately traumatized. There'd been an intruder, a break-in during the storm. He'd hidden, hadn't engaged. The man had fled. And then, God, it was terrible. Lightning must have struck him on the lawn during the storm. These things happen. Tragic, unprecedented. The weather tonight had been remarkable. The security team arrived within minutes. Found the broken patio door. Found the open safe. Found the body on the lawn. Diamonds scattered from the dropped duffel bag. Found Sterling inside, shaken but unharmed. Everything was explicable. The county medical examiner arrived 3 hours later. The body was difficult to examine initially. The discharge had done things to flesh that made conventional analysis challenging. But the circumstances were clear. Lightning strike during major coastal storm, victim caught in the open while fleeing the scene of a burglary. Tragic, but not unprecedented. These things happened during electrical storms, especially along the exposed coast. The patterns were remarkable, though. Lichtenberg figures across the entire body surface, particularly dense across the torso and arms, beautiful in a terrible way, branching fractals that look purposeful in their configuration. The examiner photographed them extensively. Later, reviewing the images, he would notice something that disturbed him. The primary branches didn't radiate outward from the strike point the way they should. They seemed to flow inward, to converge as if the electricity had been moving through the body towards some central point rather than away from it, as if the discharge had been trying to go somewhere. He logged it in his report as an unusual discharge pattern, likely an artifact of the victim's position at the moment of strike. Lightning was strange. It did strange things. There was no other explanation that made sense. But the Lichtenberg figures knew what they were. They weren't pointing forward to the next victim. They were pointing backward to the architect. Every thief who died using the fulgurite bone left a record in their own flesh. Coordinates, trajectories, targeting solutions that converged on the man who'd manufactured their deaths. The universe kept its own ledger, and it was marking Desmond Sterling with every corpse, drawing a map in lightning scars that he couldn't see, but that was being recorded nonetheless, one dead thief at a time. The wallet in Gideon's jacket pocket survived. Plastic melted, but identification still legible. Gideon Crow. No permanent address. No emergency contact. The body would be held for 30 days per protocol, then cremated when no family came forward. Desmond Sterling gave his statement to the police with appropriate shock and gratitude. Yes, he'd been home. Yes, he'd hidden when he realized someone had broken in. Yes, the storm had been remarkable. The damage to neighboring properties was tragic. He'd be making generous contributions to the county emergency fund, of course. The kind of gesture people in his position were expected to make. The diamonds were returned to Sterling's possession after being logged as evidence. The patio door was repaired. Within a week, the house showed no signs of disturbance. 2 weeks after the break-in, Sterling stood at his bedroom window watching the ocean under a clear night sky, feeling satisfied. Everything had worked perfectly. The dead thief on his lawn, the damaged neighbors, the quiet insurance settlements. His kingdom expanding one cleared property at a time. He'd need to arrange another death soon. Another Grady Holt. Another lightning strike that looked natural but was anything but. The ritual required specific conditions. A winter squall, a man standing on conductive material near the ocean, enough voltage to kill instantly and mark the flesh, but not enough to obliterate it. Delicate work. Expensive, but worthwhile. And then another thief, another desperate man who'd hear the legend whispered in the right bar, who'd test the myth, who'd commit genuine transgression. The mechanism was proven now, reliable. There would always be someone willing to steal from the dead if the promise was large enough. Within a month, Sterling had made contact with the owners of 3 damaged properties. Foundation issues, structural fires. One estate's cliffside location had been compromised by what geological surveys determined was stress fracturing, likely exacerbated by unprecedented lightning strike activity. The owners wanted to be done with the coast. Sterling paid fair prices, generous prices even. No one could say Desmond Sterling had profited from tragedy. The resort plans moved forward. The Planning Commission approved them unanimously. 3 properties consolidated, more potentially available. The land would be worth hundreds of millions once development was complete. What Sterling didn't see, what the medical examiner had noticed in the photographs but couldn't explain, was that the Lichtenberg figures on Gideon Crow's body hadn't radiated outward the way electrical scarring should. They'd flowed inward, converged, as if the electricity had been moving through the body toward some specific focal point, rather than seeking ground randomly. And if you traced those converging branches backward, if you followed the trajectories to their source, they led to a window, to a bedroom, to the exact spot where Desmond Sterling had stood 2 weeks earlier, satisfied, planning his next arrangement. The cosmic debt mechanism didn't just mark its conduits, it tracked them, recorded them. Every thief who died left coordinates in their own flesh, not forward to the next victim, but backward to the architect, to the man who manufactured their transgressions and harvested their deaths for profit. The storm wasn't Sterling's tool. Sterling was the storm's. He'd opened a door that worked both ways, and he'd been walking through it for years thinking he controlled the threshold. But the universe kept its own accounts, and collection, when it came, was never negotiable. Sterling had no idea the ledger was being balanced with his name at the bottom, one dead thief at a time. He had no idea the storm was coming for him. It just hadn't announced its arrival yet. Buster lay on the cold hardwood beside the bed, staring at the corner where the wall met the ceiling. The darkness there had weight. It pooled like spilled ink, thickening as the room settled into night. He'd been watching it for an hour now, maybe longer. Time moved strangely after Curtis went to sleep. The old man's breathing came shallow and steady from above. Buster could hear the wheeze in it, the catch at the end of each exhale. Curtis slept on his back with one arm draped across his chest, the other hanging over the mattress edge. His fingers sometimes twitched in dreams. Buster would lift his head when that happened, checking, making sure. The darkness in the corner shifted. Buster's ears went flat. He didn't growl. Growling would wake Curtis, and Curtis needed sleep. The old man barely slept anymore. Just lay there with his milky eyes open, staring at nothing, fingers worrying the edge of the blanket. The doctors had words for what was wrong with Curtis's eyes. Buster didn't understand the words. He understood that Curtis couldn't see him anymore, couldn't see the room, the window, his own hands, lived in permanent night. So Buster watched for him. The shadow thing peeled itself away from the corner, not shadow from absence of light, but shadow as substance. It came down the wall slowly, like water moving against gravity. No sound, no smell, just wrongness, pooling into the shape of something tall. The air changed. Pressure built in the room, the way it did before thunderstorms rolled down from the mountains. Buster's ears flattened against his skull, aching from the shift. The temperature dropped so fast his next breath came out as mist. He could see it hanging in the air between him and the thing, a small cloud of vapor that shouldn't exist inside a heated house. Buster's hackles rose. He got his feet under him, muscles coiled but stayed low. Stay quiet. Don't wake Curtis. The shadow thing reached the floor and stood. 7 feet tall, maybe taller. Thin everywhere. Narrow shoulders, stick limbs, body like a seam of darkness. Someone had pulled vertical. No face. Where a face should be, there was only smooth void. The moonlight coming through the window bent around it, not casting shadow, not blocking light, but warping it. The beam curved as if the thing had its own gravity, as if space itself folded wrong in its presence, where its feet touched the floor, if feet was the right word. The grain of the wood seemed to writhe. The parallel lines of the boards twisted and crawled like living things before settling back into their normal pattern after it passed. It turned toward the bed. Buster moved between it and Curtis. Low growl now, barely audible. A warning. The shadow thing didn't pause. It walked forward at each step, perfectly silent on the hardwood despite the pressure its presence put on the air. Buster could see the floor through its legs, see the grain of the wood boards where its body should block them. The wheeze of Curtis's breathing suddenly sounded distant, muffled, as if the shadow thing was absorbing sound the way it absorbed light. Buster's own growl came back to his ears, strangely flat, robbed of resonance. The shadow thing knelt beside the bed, its long fingers reaching down to the floor where Curtis's shadow lay, not reaching for Curtis, reaching for the shadow Curtis cast in the moonlight from the window. Buster watched as those fingers touched shadow, gripped shadow, began to peel shadow up from the floor like it was a layer of paint someone had left to dry. Curtis made a sound, not quite a gasp, more like air leaving him all at once. His back arched slightly. His fingers dug into the blanket, and across his forearm, where it lay exposed on top of the covers, a bruised dark shadow flashed into existence. It spread like spilled ink, following the path of the shadow piece being peeled from the floor, then faded as quickly as it had appeared, gone in the space of a heartbeat. But Buster had seen it, had watched the mark bloom across Curtis's skin, like the thing was tearing pieces from Curtis's body itself, leaving wounds that tried to manifest before being pulled back under the surface. Buster bit the shadow thing's wrist. His teeth met through empty space. He tried again, frantic now, biting at legs, at torso, at the faceless head. Nothing solid, nothing real. Like trying to fight smoke. The shadow thing pulled a strip of Curtis's shadow free. The detached piece came away dark and glistening like wet cloth. The thing folded the strip carefully, tucked it somewhere inside itself where Buster couldn't see, then reached for another piece. Curtis shuddered. His mouth opened, but no sound came out. His chest rose and fell faster, shallower. Another bruised shadow flickered across his throat, his collarbone, gone before Buster could track where it had been. Like the thing was pulling marks up through Curtis's skin from somewhere deep inside. Buster barked. Full voice now, hoarse and desperate. The sound fell flat in the pressurized air, absorbed by the shadow thing's presence. Curtis didn't stir. The shadow thing didn't even look at him. Just kept working, slow and patient. Peeling away another strip of Curtis's shadow, another, folding each piece into itself like someone harvesting cloth from a loom. Curtis's shadow on the floor grew paler, thinner. The parts the thing had taken didn't grow back. Then the shadow thing stood, turned, and walked back to the corner. It climbed the wall the way it had descended, against gravity, against sense, and disappeared into the darkness at the ceiling's edge. The pressure released. The air warmed. The room felt normal again, as if the past 10 minutes had been a pocket of wrongness that had sealed itself off and vanished. The shadows in the corners were just shadows. Curtis's breathing, still shallow and pained, came back to normal volume in Buster's ears. Buster jumped onto the bed. Curtis lay still, eyes open and sightless, staring at the ceiling. His skin felt cooler than it had an hour ago. Buster nosed his cheek, whining low in his throat. Curtis's hand came up slowly, fingers fumbling until they found Buster's head. The touch was weak. His hand shook. He patted twice, the way he always did when Buster worried. The gesture meant comfort, but the hand delivering it had no strength. The fingers trembled against Buster's skull and then slipped away, falling back to the blanket. Buster pressed his head harder against Curtis's chest, not dreaming. He'd seen it, watched it take pieces of Curtis away. Curtis's breathing evened out, slowed, unconscious again, not sleeping. There was a difference. Buster could tell. He lay down beside Curtis, pressed close against his side, felt the too cool skin through his fur, stayed alert, ears forward, watching the corner, waiting for it to come back. Morning came gray through the window. Curtis hadn't moved since the thing left. Buster had stayed awake all night, watching, listening for the sound of shadow peeling away from a wall. He jumped down from the bed and nosed Curtis's hand. No response. He barked once, sharp. Curtis's eyelids fluttered but didn't open. Buster went to the nightstand and knocked Curtis's pill bottle to the floor. It rattled loud on the hardwood. Curtis's eyes opened. His hand reached out, trembling, found the edge of the mattress, and used it to pull himself upright. The effort left him breathing hard. He sat there for a long time, head bowed, shoulders shaking. Curtis wrapped his arms around himself. His whole body was shaking now, teeth chattering, though the house held its steady warmth. It wasn't cold. The house was the same temperature it always was. Buster could feel the warmth from the heating vent, smell the dust burning off the coils. Curtis was wrong. Curtis was colder, not the room. The old man felt his way to standing, one hand on the nightstand, other groping for his walker. His legs trembled. He had always been thin, but now Buster could see the bones of his ankles through his skin, sharp as sticks. Curtis made it 3 steps toward the bathroom before his knees buckled. Buster was there before he hit the floor, solid and steady, letting Curtis grab his collar, brace his weight. Curtis's fingers dug in hard enough to hurt. Buster didn't move, held himself rigid until Curtis got his feet under him again. Curtis's hand found Buster's head, patted twice. They made it to the bathroom together. Curtis leaning on the walker with one hand, other hand resting on Buster's shoulders. Each step took forever. Halfway there, Curtis stopped, breathing like he'd run a mile. His chest heaved. Sweat had broken out across his forehead despite the shaking. Inside the bathroom, Curtis gripped the sink and turned his face toward the mirror. Not seeing it. Couldn't see anything. But facing it the way he had every morning for 70 years. Buster watched from the doorway. Curtis's reflection was there in the glass, but paler than it should be. Washed out. Like someone had drained the color from it. Curtis ran the tap, splashed water on his face. His hand shook so badly, water ran down his wrists and soaked his sleeve. He gave up after a few tries, let the water run, stood there gripping the sink while his shoulders heaved. Buster pushed into the bathroom, pressed himself against Curtis's legs. Curtis reached down, found his head. They stayed like that until Curtis could breathe again. Getting back to bed took even longer. Curtis's feet dragged. He stopped every few steps, head bowing, whole body shaking with effort. By the time he made it to the mattress, he could barely lift his legs high enough to sit down. Buster jumped up beside him. Curtis fell back against the pillows and didn't move again. His chest rose and fell in shallow little gasps. His skin had gone gray. The shadow on the floor beneath the bed was noticeably paler than it had been yesterday, thinner. In the places where the thing had peeled strips away, Curtis's shadow was nearly transparent. Buster could see the pattern of the hardwood through it. He lay down on the bed next to Curtis and watched the corner where the ceiling met the wall. The darkness there looked heavier than the shadows elsewhere in the room, hungrier. It would come back when night fell. Buster knew it the way he knew the smell of rain before a storm. Curtis's breathing slowed, evened, not sleep. That other thing. The absence he fell into now instead of sleeping. Buster pressed closer and waited. The days bled together. Curtis ate less, moved less. Sometimes his eyes would track wrong, following sounds that weren't there, flinching from nothing. His hands had developed a tremor that didn't stop. When he tried to hold his coffee cup, it clattered against his teeth. Buster stopped, leaving his side. Curtis needed help getting to the bathroom now, and needed help getting back. The walker sat unused in the corner. Curtis was too weak to use it. He leaned his full weight on Buster instead, fingers wound tight in the fur at Buster's shoulders, feet barely lifting as he shuffled forward. And every night, the shadow thing returned. It came at different hours. Sometimes just after Curtis fell into that not-sleeping state. Sometimes near dawn. But it always came. Always brought with it that terrible pressure in the air, that sudden temperature drop that made Buster's breath mist, that feeling of sound being swallowed before it could fully form. Always climbed down from the corner where ceiling met wall. Always knelt beside the bed and peeled away more of Curtis's shadow from the floor. And always now, those bruised shadows flashed across Curtis's skin, fleeting marks that appeared in the wake of each harvested strip, across his arms, his chest, his face, before fading back into nothingness. Each one looked like proof of violence. Each one disappeared before morning came. But Buster saw them, watched the dark blooms spread and vanish, marking Curtis as the shadow thing's victim in a language that only lasted seconds. Buster tried everything. He stationed himself between Curtis and the corner, blocking the path. The shadow thing walked through him. He dragged Curtis's blanket over the side of the bed to cover the shadow on the floor. The shadow thing stepped forward. Where it moved, the blanket seemed to slide away on its own, as if the air around the thing pushed objects aside without touch. The shadow remained exposed, and the thing continued its work. He tried attacking the moment it manifested before it reached the bed. His jaws snapped on empty air. His claws scraped hardwood. The shadow thing didn't pause and didn't acknowledge him, just kept walking with that terrible patience through the pressurized air it brought with it. The only thing Buster could do was watch. Watch as those fingers gripped shadow flesh and peeled it free. Watch as Curtis's body jerked and shuddered. Watch as the bruise marks flickered across Curtis's skin like echoes of internal wounds trying to surface. Watch as Curtis's shadow on the floor grew thinner, paler, more transparent with each visitation. Something changed on the fourth night. Buster was in his usual position, between the bed and the corner, hackles raised, ready for the pressure and the cold and the wrongness. The shadow thing descended as it always did, reached the floor, turned toward the bed, and stopped. It stood there, faceless head angled toward Buster, not moving, not continuing to the bed, just looking at him. Buster's growl died in his throat. His legs locked. The pressure in the air intensified until his ears felt like they might burst. The cold deepened, sharp enough that frost formed on his whiskers. The void where a face should be gave nothing away. No eyes, no expression. Just smooth emptiness. But Buster felt the weight of its attention anyway. Felt himself being observed by something immense and ancient and utterly without mercy. Not cruel, not malicious. Just indifferent in a way that was worse than hatred. Something that saw him as irrelevant, as furniture, as an obstacle of no more significance than a chair that happened to be in its path. The moment stretched. Buster couldn't move, couldn't breathe, could only stand there pinned under that terrible, emotionless regard while the cold burned his lungs and the pressure crushed his skull. Then the shadow thing turned away, dismissed him, returned its attention to Curtis, walked to the bed as if Buster had never existed. Buster's legs gave out. He collapsed to the floor, panting, while the shadow thing knelt and resumed its work. While Curtis's body shuddered and the bruise marks bloomed and faded. While strips of shadow peeled away and disappeared into the thing's faceless form. When it left, climbing back to the corner and vanishing into the ceiling, Buster stayed on the floor, shaking. The message had been clear. Fight all you want. I will not notice. I will not stop. You are nothing. By the fifth night, Buster saw Curtis's shadow was now thin enough to see the grain of the floorboards through it completely. In the places where the thing had harvested the most, there were gaps, patches of floor where no shadow fell at all, even with moonlight streaming through the window. The bruise marks that flickered across Curtis's skin during the harvesting had started lasting longer before they faded, seconds instead of heartbeats. Dark enough that Buster could see the exact shape of each stolen piece mapped onto Curtis's body like a brand. Curtis barely woke anymore. He lay in bed with his eyes half open, breath coming in shallow sips. His skin had gone the color of old newspaper. When Buster pressed his nose to Curtis's hand, the flesh felt like wax, cold and waxy and wrong. The neighbor woman came by on the 5th day. Buster heard her knock, heard her call through the door. He barked once. She tried the knob. Curtis never locked it anymore, had stopped bothering months ago, and let herself in. She found Curtis in bed. Buster heard her gasp, heard her footsteps rush to the bedside. She put her hand on Curtis's forehead and made a sound low in her throat. Then she was on her phone, voice quick and tight, giving the address, saying words Buster didn't understand, unresponsive, hypothermic, pulse thready. The ambulance people came with their equipment and their urgent voices. They wrapped Curtis in blankets, lifted him onto a rolling bed, wheeled him out. Buster tried to follow, but the neighbor woman caught his collar. She was saying something about calling someone, about finding his papers, about how Curtis would want him taken care of. Her voice was kind, but her grip was firm. Buster pulled against it, whining, watching through the open door as they loaded Curtis into the ambulance. Then the doors closed and the ambulance left, and Curtis was gone. The neighbor woman stayed. She found Buster's food, filled his bowl, ran her hand over his head while he stood rigid and trembling. She checked Curtis's bedroom, made a sound of dismay at the mess. Blankets twisted on the floor, pill bottles knocked over, water glass tipped and spilled. She gathered the blankets to wash them, picked up the pills, mopped the spilled water. She didn't see Curtis's shadow. It was still there on the floor beside the bed, so faint now it was barely visible even in direct sunlight. A thin gray outline, gap-toothed with missing pieces, transparent as tissue paper. The neighbor woman left as the sun was going down. She locked the door behind her, said something through it about coming back tomorrow, about checking on him. And her footsteps faded down the porch steps. Buster stood in the kitchen and listened to the house settle into evening. The refrigerator hummed. The heating vent clicked and breathed warm air. Outside, wind moved through the pines. Curtis's bedroom door stood open. Buster walked to it slowly. The room smelled wrong now, smelled like the neighbor woman's soap and the ambulance people's rubber gloves. It didn't smell like Curtis anymore, just medicine and strangers and emptiness. The bed was made, clean sheets pulled tight, pillows fluffed. The neighbor woman had worked fast. Buster jumped up onto the mattress. It didn't smell like Curtis either, just detergent. He turned in a circle once, twice, then lay down in the spot where Curtis's head usually rested, curled himself into a tight ball, waited. Night came. The darkness in the corner where wall met ceiling began to pool. The pressure built. Temperature dropped. Buster's breath misted in the suddenly arctic air. The shadow thing descended. Buster's ears flattened, but he didn't move from Curtis's pillow. Just watched as it climbed down the wall, reached the floor, stood. The moonlight bent around its form. The floorboards beneath it writhed and twisted before settling back into their grain. It turned toward the bed, toward the spot where Curtis's shadow should be. Curtis's shadow was still there, faint and torn and nearly transparent, but there. The neighbor woman had remade the bed over top it without seeing it. The shadow lay beneath the clean sheets now, pressed between fabric and floor like something dried and preserved. The shadow thing walked to the bedside. The air grew so cold Buster's ears ached. The pressure made his skull feel like it was being squeezed in a fist. Sound dampened to near silence. The house's creaks and settling, the wind outside, all of it muffled to nothingness. The thing knelt. Its long fingers reached for the shadow. Buster lunged. He knew it wouldn't work. He had tried it a dozen times, but he lunged anyway, snarling, snapping at the thing's arms, its torso, its faceless head. His teeth closed on nothing. His weight passed through it without resistance. He might as well have been biting at moonlight. The shadow thing pulled back the sheets. Curtis's shadow lay exposed on the floor. So thin now it looked like smoke. So pale it was almost invisible except where the moonlight caught it at certain angles. The shadow thing's fingers touched it, and the shadow moved, not being peeled away, moving on its own. It rippled like water disturbed by wind. The gaps where pieces had been harvested began to close, edges drawing together, knitting themselves into something more complete. The torn places sealed. The transparent patches darkened. Buster stopped mid-snarl. The shadow was pulling itself back together. The shadow thing's fingers dug in, trying to grip it, but the shadow slipped through like liquid. It flowed away from those grasping hands, gathered itself, and began to rise, not up from the floor, up into the air, taking shape as it climbed, shoulders forming, head, arms. A silhouette of Curtis carved from darkness and moonlight, standing now in the space between the bed and the wall. The shadow thing rose to face it. They stood motionless. The faceless shadow peeler and the Curtis-shaped darkness. Neither moved. Neither made sound. Then the Curtis shadow reached out. Its hand passed into the shadow thing's chest, sank deep. When it pulled back, it was holding something, a strip of darkness that looked thicker, richer than the Curtis shadow itself. The piece the shadow thing had harvested. The Curtis shadow pressed the strip back into itself. The darkness absorbed it, grew slightly more solid, slightly less transparent. The shadow thing didn't fight, didn't pull away, just stood there while the Curtis shadow reached into it again, retrieved another harvested piece, reintegrated it. Again. Again. With each piece returned, the Curtis shadow grew more defined. The edges sharpened. The gaps filled. Buster could see the shape of Curtis's shoulders now, the slope of his back, the bend of his arm. The last piece came free. The Curtis shadow held it for a moment, darkness dripping from its palm like water, then pressed it into its chest. The shadow solidified, darkened, became complete, and then it turned. It looked at Buster. Buster's hackles dropped. His snarl died. He stood frozen on the bed, staring into the place where Curtis's face should be. There was no face, just shadow. But Buster knew those eyes, even though he couldn't see them. The Curtis shadow took a step toward the bed. Then another. It moved like Curtis had moved, slow, careful. The gait of someone whose body didn't work right anymore. One hand reached out. Buster didn't move, couldn't move. The hand came closer. Fingers extended toward his head. Cold air touched his skull. Not the metal and dust cold of the shadow peeler. Different. This was the cold of winter mornings when Curtis would let him out before sunrise. The cold of Curtis's hands after Curtis had been working in the yard, fingers chilled from gripping tools. Familiar cold. The Curtis shadow's hand passed through Buster's head. Buster felt it anyway. Felt the weight of it, the pressure. Felt Curtis's palm settling between his ears the way it had 10,000 times before. Felt the fingers scratching behind one ear in that particular spot Curtis always found. The cold moved through him like a current. Not painful. Just there. Just Curtis trying to pet him one more time through a barrier neither of them could cross. Buster whined, high and broken. The hand pulled back. The Curtis shadow straightened. Behind it, the shadow peeler stood motionless, waiting. Buster understood then. Understood with sudden, terrible clarity. The shadow peeler hadn't been stealing Curtis away. Curtis had been trying to leave, had been trying to separate from something that kept pulling him back, kept tethering him to the bed, kept refusing to let him go. Buster had thought he was protecting Curtis. He'd been trapping him. The Curtis shadow turned back to face the shadow peeler, stepped toward it. The shadow peeler opened its arms. Buster barked, short and sharp. No. The Curtis shadow stopped, turned again, looked at Buster with those invisible eyes. Buster barked again, louder, jumped down from the bed, put himself between Curtis' shadow and shadow peeler, the way he'd done every night, the way he'd always done, protecting Curtis, keeping him safe. That was Buster's job. That was what he was for. The Curtis shadow reached out again. This time its hand came to rest on Buster's head and stayed there. The cold weight of it pressed down, solid and real for just a moment. Just long enough for Buster to feel fingers curling in his fur, feel Curtis holding on one more time. Then the weight lifted. The Curtis shadow stepped around Buster, walked to the shadow peeler. The two shapes merged. Curtis shadow flowing into shadow peeler, darkness folding into darkness, until Buster couldn't tell where one ended and the other began. The combined shadow began to fade. Buster lunged forward, snapped at empty air where the shadow had been, bit at nothing, barked until his throat was raw, pawed at the floor where Curtis's shadow had lain, gone. Both of them. The shadow tether was gone. But Curtis's body, miles away in the hospital, still held him, still kept him from leaving completely, not until that last heartbeat stopped. Buster spun in a circle, searching. Nothing in the corner, nothing by the bed, nothing climbing the walls. The room was just a room again, empty and clean and full of moonlight. He jumped back onto the bed, turned in circles, jumped down, ran to the corner, sniffing frantically at the baseboards, ran back to the bed. Curtis's scent was gone from the sheets. The neighbor woman had washed it all away. Buster barked at the ceiling, at the walls, at the empty air. Nothing answered. He stood in the middle of the bedroom, ribs heaving, and slowly the barking stopped. Slowly his hackles settled. Slowly his breathing evened. The house ticked and settled around him. Refrigerator hummed from the kitchen, wind in the pines outside. His own heartbeat loud in his ears. Curtis was gone. Buster had let him go. No, not let him go. Had driven him away by holding on too hard, by refusing to understand, by doing what he thought was protecting when Curtis needed release. Buster walked to the spot beside the bed where he'd spent every night for the past week, the spot where he'd kept watch, where he'd tried so hard to fight off the thing he thought was hurting Curtis. He lay down, curled tight, put his head on his paws, and waited for Curtis to come home. The neighbor woman came back in the morning. Buster heard her key in the lock, heard the door open, heard her footsteps in the kitchen. She called his name. He didn't move from beside the bed. She found him there. Knelt down, ran her hand over his head. Said something in that voice people used when they were trying to sound calm. She'd brought food, fresh water. She filled his bowls, called him to the kitchen. Buster stayed where he was. She tried to coax him, tried patting her leg, making encouraging sounds, rattling the food bowl. He watched her from the floor but didn't get up. Eventually she left the food and water where they were and went to sit in Curtis's chair in the living room. He could hear her on the phone, talking to someone about Curtis, about arrangements. Her voice stayed steady at first. Then it started to shake. She came back to the bedroom, knelt beside him again. This time her eyes were red. She told him Curtis had died. This morning before dawn. The hospital had called her an hour ago. Said his heart had simply stopped. Said it had been peaceful. She didn't understand that Curtis had left last night. That the body in the hospital had been empty since the moment Curtis's soul merged with the shadow thing and disappeared from the bedroom. What had stopped beating this morning was just the shell, the husk. The thing Buster had kept going through sheer refusal to let it rest, until Curtis had finally torn himself free. The woman talked about arrangements, about Curtis's nephew coming from out of state, about what would happen to the house, to Curtis's things, to Buster himself. Her voice was gentle, but Buster heard the worry in it. She didn't know what Curtis had wanted done with him. Didn't know if the nephew would take him. Didn't know if there was anyone else. Buster didn't care. It didn't matter what happened to him now. The woman stayed longer this time. Brought him outside, stood with him while he relieved himself in the yard, tried to get him to walk a little. He went through the motions because it was easier than resisting. Let her lead him around the house. Let her put fresh food in his bowl. Let her check him over for injuries she thought might explain why he wouldn't eat. She didn't find anything wrong. Nothing she could see, anyway. When she left, Buster went back to the bedroom and lay down in his spot beside the bed. The spot where he'd kept watch for all those nights. Where he'd stationed himself between Curtis and the corner. He stared at the corner. Remembered the darkness pooling there. The pressure building. The temperature dropping until his breath misted. The way the moonlight bent wrong around the shadow thing's form. The writhing floorboards beneath its feet. The terrible moment when it had stopped and looked at him. When he'd felt the weight of its tired acknowledgement and mistaken it for scorn. He remembered Curtis's body jerking as each piece of shadow was peeled away. The bruise marks flickering across Curtis's skin. Proof, he'd thought, of wounds being done, violence happening. Those marks had been Curtis's pain showing through, the hurt of trying to tear free from a body that wouldn't let go. Each bruised shadow had been a cry for help that Buster had heard as reason to fight harder. Night fell. The corner stayed dark in the normal way. No pooling shadow, no shape descending. The pattern was burned into Buster's nerves, but the wrongness didn't come back. The shadow thing was gone. Its work was done. Around midnight, Buster heard something. Not in the bedroom, outside. Faint scratching at the back door. He lifted his head. The sound came again. Deliberate, rhythmic. The pattern Curtis used to use when his hands were full and he needed Buster to nose the door open from inside. Buster got to his feet, stood swaying for a moment. 3 days without food had made him weak, then walked slowly to the kitchen. The scratching stopped, started again. Buster reached the back door, stared at it. On the other side, he heard breathing, slow and steady. Familiar. He nosed the door. It swung open. Nothing there. Just the back step and the yard beyond, illuminated in moonlight. Pines swaying in the breeze. Frost silvering the grass. The cold air that came through the open door smelled like winter. Like the mornings Curtis used to let him out before sunrise. Like Curtis's hands after Curtis had been working in the yard. Buster stepped out onto the porch. The door swung shut behind him. He stood at the top of the steps, scanning the yard. Shadows moved as pine branches shifted, but nothing else. No figure waiting. No Curtis standing by the shed or near the fence or at the edge of the trees. Then he felt it. Pressure on the top of his head. Cold and familiar. The weight of a hand settling between his ears, fingers curling into his fur, thumb scratching that particular spot. Not the terrible pressure of the shadow thing's presence. Not the skull-crushing weight of wrongness in the air, Just Curtis's hand, the way it had always felt, the way it was always supposed to feel. Buster closed his eyes. The pressure moved. Down his neck, along his spine, the way Curtis used to stroke him when they sat together on the porch in the evenings. Slow and gentle. The touch of someone who had all the time in the world and nothing to do but sit with his dog. Buster leaned into it. Felt the cold move through him like water. Felt Curtis's presence as solid as it had ever been. Just on the other side of whatever membrane separated living from dead. The hand came to rest on Buster's shoulders. Stayed there. A long moment of contact, of recognition, of goodbye. Then the pressure intensified. Stopped being gentle. Became something else. A weight that pressed down on Buster's whole body. Drove him to the porch floor. He yelped. Not from pain, but from surprise. And tried to stand. Couldn't. The weight held him pinned. And then warmth flooded through him. Not the cold of Curtis's shadow touch. Real warmth. Body heat. The warmth of Curtis sitting in his chair with Buster's head on his lap, hand resting on Buster's side, both of them drowsing in afternoon sun. The warmth concentrated in Buster's chest, grew hotter, painful, like something burning its way through him from the inside. He whined, squirmed. The weight held him still. The burning spread. Down his legs, up his neck, into his skull. Everywhere Curtis's hand had touched. Everywhere Curtis had ever touched. Every place Curtis's warmth had ever reached. Buster's vision blurred. The moonlit yard swam and doubled. His breath came in gasps. The burning peaked, held, then began to fade. As it ebbed, so did the weight. The pressure on his shoulders lifted. The cold presence that was Curtis withdrew. Buster lay panting on the porch boards. His whole body trembled. The warmth was still there in his chest, cooling now, but not disappearing, settling into something permanent, something he could carry. He pushed himself to his feet, stood swaying. The yard was empty. No cold presence, no invisible hand. Just wind in the pines and frost on the grass and the infinite silence of a Montana night. But the warmth in Buster's chest remained, glowing like an ember, like Curtis had reached through the barrier between dead and living one more time, reached all the way in and planted part of himself inside Buster's ribs where it couldn't be lost, where it would stay. Buster stood on the porch and understood finally what Curtis had been trying to tell him. Not goodbye, not I'm leaving. Something else. I'm here. The shadow peeler had freed Curtis from the decaying body. The hospital had let the body die. But Curtis himself hadn't gone anywhere. Had just changed. Moved from one place to another. From outside Buster to inside him. The warmth in Buster's chest pulsed once. Gentle, familiar. Buster walked down the porch steps into the yard. The grass crunched under his paws. The cold air bit at his nose. He walked to the fence at the property edge and stood there, looking out at the pines silhouetted against the stars. Curtis was gone. Curtis was still here. Both true at once. Buster had spent days thinking he'd failed. Thinking he'd trapped Curtis, hurt Curtis, made everything worse by refusing to understand. But Curtis had come back anyway. Had reached through whatever separated them and left Buster a piece of himself. Not as punishment, as gift. As proof that letting go didn't mean losing. Buster stood at the fence until the sky began to pale. Until the first bird started calling. Until the warmth in his chest had settled into something he could carry without burning. Then he turned and walked back to the house. Went inside, found his food bowl in the kitchen, and ate for the first time in days. The house was quiet around him, empty. But the warmth in his chest stayed constant. Curtis was here, would always be here, in that warmth, in the memory of cold hands that became warm, in the weight of an invisible touch that said, I see you, and I'm with you, and you did the hardest thing right. You let me go. Buster finished eating, drank water, went to the bedroom and lay down beside the bed. The morning light came through the window, illuminating the floor where Curtis's shadow used to fall. Nothing there now, just empty floor, just light. Buster closed his eyes and felt the warmth in his chest pulse again. Steady as a heartbeat, eternal as devotion. Curtis was free. Curtis was home. Both places at once. The nephew came a week later. He was younger than Curtis had been, moved differently, smelled of cologne and city air. He walked through the house, making notes on a tablet, opening cabinets, checking closets. The neighbor woman had let him in, stayed to help, kept glancing at Buster with worried eyes. The nephew saw Buster and stopped. This the dog? He asked the neighbor woman. She nodded, said Buster's name, said Curtis had loved him more than anything. The nephew approached slowly, hand extended. Buster sniffed it. The hand smelled like rental car and hotel soap. Nothing threatening, nothing familiar. Hey, boy, the nephew said. You come with me, okay? Got a yard back home. Kids would love a dog. Buster let the nephew pet his head. The touch was tentative, uncertain. Not like Curtis's hands. Those had known exactly where to scratch, exactly how much pressure, exactly when Buster needed comfort versus play. But the touch was kind. That mattered. The nephew and the neighbor woman talked logistics, about the drive back to Denver, about whether Buster had all his shots, about the vet records Curtis had kept in a folder in the kitchen drawer. Buster walked to Curtis's chair in the living room, the one Curtis used to sit in every evening, hand resting on Buster's head while they watched the window together. He sniffed the cushion. Curtis's scent was almost gone, just the faintest trace under the smell of dust and emptiness. He jumped up into the chair anyway, curled himself into the depression Curtis's body had worn into the cushion over years of sitting. The fabric held the shape of Curtis, even if it no longer held the smell. The warmth in Buster's chest pulsed, steady, constant. The nephew came over, knelt beside the chair. I know this is hard, he said quietly. I know Uncle Curtis was everything to you, but he wants you taken care of. He told me once, if anything happened to him, I should make sure you went somewhere good. Buster looked at the nephew. The man's eyes were sad. Not the deep grief the neighbor woman carried, but genuine sadness. The nephew had loved Curtis, too, in whatever way family loved family. Hadn't seen him much. Hadn't been part of the daily life. But the love had been there. You're a good boy, the nephew said. Curtis told me that every time we talked. Said you were the best thing that ever happened to him after Aunt Linda died. The nephew's hand came to rest on Buster's head. Careful, respectful, not trying to replace Curtis, just offering what comfort he could. Buster leaned into the touch slightly. Not the same. Would never be the same. But kind. The nephew was kind. The warmth in his chest pulsed again. Curtis approving. Curtis saying, yes, this is okay. Curtis saying, I'm still here and I always will be, and you can go now. You can let go of the house, you can let go of the bed, you can let go of waiting for me to come home because I already am home, in you, where it matters. The nephew stood, went to gather Curtis's things, the important papers, the photos, the mementos worth keeping. The neighbor woman had already packed Buster's food, his bowls, his old rope toy that Curtis used to throw for him in the yard. Buster stayed in the chair until the nephew came back with a leash. Ready, boy? Buster jumped down, stood still while the nephew clipped the leash to his collar. Together they walked through the house one last time, past Curtis's bedroom with its empty bed, past the kitchen where Curtis used to make coffee every morning, past the back door where Curtis's invisible hand had pressed down on Buster's shoulders and left warmth behind. The door closed, locked. The nephew helped Buster into the back seat of the rental car. The neighbor woman waved from the porch, hand over her mouth, crying openly now. The car pulled away. Buster watched through the window as the house grew smaller, as the pines that lined the property receded, as the road curved and took away the last glimpse of the place he'd lived with Curtis for 12 years. The warmth in his chest stayed constant, didn't fade with distance, didn't diminish as the miles accumulated. Curtis was there, would always be there, in the cold that became warm, in the weight of an invisible hand, in the final gift of understanding that love didn't end when life did. It just changed form. Buster had thought he was losing Curtis. He'd been learning how to carry him. The car drove on through Montana morning, sun rising over the mountains, frost melting off the fields. In the back seat, Buster curled up on the borrowed blanket and closed his eyes. The warmth pulsed, steady as a heartbeat, eternal as devotion. Home.